The most widely published book in human history reveals that we are created in the image of God. Throughout our human journey, each encounter is an opportunity to see the shared humanity in ourselves and others. Regardless of one's views on religion, each experience and each story weaves us together towards a common path. A path of transformation, a process of growth and understanding, a recognition that, at our core, we share a common destiny. What does the search for truth really mean in our lives? How can we find a sense of unity in a world so diverse and divided? As we reflect on these questions, we start to uncover a fundamental connection that binds us all beyond our differences. Welcome to Created in the Image of God, Building Vibrant Communities, with our host, Wade Franson. Today's episode is Your Jesus is Too American.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Created in the Image of God. I am your host, Wade Franson, and I have a guest in the studio today who has written a book called Your Jesus is Too American. His name is Steve Bezner, and he's a pastor, professor, and author who serves as associate pastor of pastoral ministry and theology at Truett Seminary at Baylor University. Associate professor, I think I said associate pastor, associate professor of pastoral ministry. After more than a decade as senior pastor of Houston Northwest Church, Steve has become known for helping Christians think more clearly about discipleship, culture, and the ways American values can distort the way we follow Jesus. Welcome to the studio, Steve.
Wade, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. I've been saying in recent months that it feels like we're going through an ideological civil war in our country. Now, I'm associated with groups going back into the 60s and 70s that laid the groundwork for some of this by focusing on evangelical integrity and the need for one nation under God. But over time, things have divided and, the camps are pitted against each other. I'm interested and intrigued to see how you approach this topic in a way that hopefully highlights challenges, but also brings people together. And I'm sure that's a focal point of your work, which we'll get into. As we always like to do on the show, though, we like to get to know the real you, your early history, the forces that shaped you in life. So tell us a little bit about your parents and the circumstances that you grew up in.
Yeah, thanks, Wade. I really appreciate it. I grew up in a small town in North Texas, surrounded by farmland. The town itself had about 15,000 folks in it. Most of my family and extended family lived in the next town over, which had a population of about 800 people. And so family was very much in proximity, grandparents, parents, cousins, aunts, uncles, all of that. We were all very geographically very close. My parents were married young, which I think was very common in their day. And they came from two very distinct religious traditions. My father was Catholic. My mom was Baptist. And all of that to say that church and faith was very central in our home, but at the same time, conflict arose between the two of them pretty early on. I was very young, so I don't know that I can speak definitively about what exactly those things were, but I can say that by the time that I was 6, my parents were divorced. And that began sort of this interesting journey because I was on the every other weekend visitation schedule. And so I would go to First Baptist Church of Gainesville, Texas with red carpet and hymnals and choir robes on one Sunday. And then the next Sunday, I would go to Mass at St. Peter's or St. Mary's, depending on what we were doing. And I would hear entirely different music and would hear the creed recited and experience the fullness of the liturgy and the icons and all of the different symbols that were part of that. And so I think that early on, you don't even realize as a child what's happening, but you're developing an appreciation for two very different expressions of faith. And I think that in a lot of ways that planted some seeds for me, because I learned very young how to see good and positive things in very different traditions. And so that was probably a more formative experience than I realized. My dad and stepmom ended up moving to the Austin area sometime later. I don't remember the exact date, but I'm going to say maybe 3 or 4 years later. And there was this kind of interesting season where the church that my mom was part of also kind of gave this other interesting moment for me, which was I learned how to be received into community. And I don't know what everyone's background was, but this was a Southern Baptist church. They had Wednesday night dinner. They had activities for children. And they had this program at our church. The title of it was Royal Ambassadors. And I don't know if anyone in your audience knows about Royal Ambassadors, but it was essentially Baptist Boy Scouts. And so we would study the Bible, but we would also learn how to tie knots and go camping and that kind of thing. And the men in that group, they were oil field workers. They were, part of a trucking company. But early on, they just paid me attention and they loved me. And I think that maybe one of the other seeds in my life for appreciating people expressing love freely came from these blue collar, greasy handed sort of, guys who just loved and received me. So those are kind of two distinct experiences sort of in my background that I think probably pointed me towards the church and maybe even eventually becoming a pastor. And then, grew up, was part of like a youth group and really enjoyed studying the Bible. And I think that sort of set me on a trajectory of discovering church and really appreciating it.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. When you first said North Texas, I was thinking Dallas, but you were probably a little bit north of that with numbers that small in your hometown. And when you talked about the Royal Ambassadors, I'm reminded I spent time up in Alaska as a kid, and also child of divorce. And they weren't oil men, but there were people that were grounded, let's say, in the real world, in the real life, that were involved in some of the youth stuff that I was involved in. So we did youth camps, and I remember one particular time we did this portage canoe trip through 7 lakes with 3 overnights, and then on the way home we canoed down the Moose River for 12 hours to get back to where we were picked up. So we were out in the wilderness for very memorable. Saw a black bear, from no further than you are from me, figuratively here, just across a little creek, and very impressionable. But yeah, it was the time that those people donated,
absolutely,
to engage with the young people in the church that really cemented the value of it, of living it out, right? Not professing, but actually doing your faith.
I love that. Yeah, that sounds exactly right. Those men, I don't know that they would have then or now qualified themselves as theologians, but they really they taught me what it meant to embody love, and I really appreciated that at a very young age.
Yeah. So the other part that struck me was the reflection on shuttling back and forth between parents on the week, week to week, and obviously having to accept that your parents didn't get along, had different views, different perspectives, different lives, perhaps different lifestyles, but each of them was still one of your parents. And then experiencing that in church helped me to kind of imagine, that would be helpful to bridge differences that otherwise might cause people to shun one another, judge one another, we're right, they're wrong kind of thing. But as a child of divorce, you're half mom, half dad.
Yeah.
And you can understand and hopefully understand and respect both of them. And it sounds like that maybe incorporated into your faith walk as well a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, there are certain people that I think whenever they're divorced, it's a very amicable, peaceful process. That was not the case in my family when I was a child. And I think that maybe the through line of going to church each Sunday provided a moment where I saw, well, these are different things, but they also have a lot of similarities. And I mean, Wade, I would say it kind of taught me how to be someone who could see good in a lot of different perspectives early on. And maybe this might be a bit of a stretch, but I feel like it got me thinking about peacemaking and bridge building. I wouldn't have obviously used those words, but it got me thinking in those terms very, very young.
Well, yeah, we didn't really focus too much on in the opening here, but some of the work you've done is in church collaboration, racial reconciliation, and interfaith bridge building.
Right.
So some of those things, obviously had their root, their seed in those activities. So tell us a little bit then about that sort of coming of age epiphany, of how to now apply some of those inputs, such as seeing these men and realizing the value of what they were doing and wanting to do your own.
Yeah. I think that, as I was, headed to college, 18, you start thinking it's kind of a natural time to ask, what do I want to do with my life? And I think that sort of having this sort of maybe relational gap when I had not been close with my biological father, I think that I gravitated towards a place where I could experience that sort of relational connection. So I think church was natural for that. And so I had this idea of bridge building, peacemaking. I had enjoyed church and the relationships and the love that I had experienced there. And I had been deeply affected by the fact that people had helped me at an early age. And so, again, I don't know that I would have used this language, but I wanted to help others. And so that became this thing that grew inside of me to say, well, then maybe I can serve in a church. And so I think that some people are drawn to church maybe because of dogma or doctrine, theology. I'm not downplaying any of those things or trying to poo-poo those things. That was just not what drew me to church. What drew me to church was the opportunity to say, there's a lot of people who are lonely, that are in need, who need help. And I think that the church is a great space to be able to extend help within a community. That really drew me in. And honestly, it's the thing that has kept me there for a very long time.
Awesome. Well, that's, I think, a great introduction. Tell us just a little bit about this book, Jesus is Too American, as we go into the commercial break and get into the meat and potatoes of what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah. So it's kind of funny how you look back, you see all these connections, but what ended up happening, I began to discover that, as you already mentioned, ideology was really something that was infecting a lot of congregations, but specifically churches I had been part of, that I'd grown up in, that I was currently pastoring, and that people were viewing one another as enemies, people who were their neighbors, people who were family members, rather than being in a place where they felt connected to and wanted to help one another. And that really struck me as tragic, because obviously within the church, we're supposed to be the sorts of people that want to help one another, love one another, build up community, and that sort of thing. So I kind of went on this journey where I just said, what is it that is discipling the people who are in my congregation? And what I discovered is that it was essentially social media and cable news. That's a little bit of an oversimplification, but essentially it was the internet and television. And I realized that what Jesus had taught and what Jesus had said was far less important in their lives, even though they would go by the name Christian. And so I just really wanted to say, what would it look like to lean into that? What would it look like to lean into the idea that if we're Christians, we're going to follow what it was that Jesus taught, and how would we hold that up in comparison against social media, YouTube, cable news? And in doing so, that's where the book got its start.
Awesome. Well, let's go to that quick commercial break. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about how that works out inside the community that you serve in, and also, looking outward, and the point of the book to reach audiences with this message, and talk a little bit about what it is and why and how that can help us. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with more of Steve Bezner on Created in the Image of God.
Soul Seeds is both a one-day community garden experience and an annual roadmap for integrating and revitalizing local communities. In a single day, Soul Seeds brings youth, families, residents, and volunteers together to transform underused space into a living garden, planting not just vegetables and flowers, but the seeds of service, self-reliance, and community. But Soul Seeds doesn't end in one day. It becomes an annual plan. Plant together, manage together through shared care, youth leadership, and community connection. And harvest together food, beauty, trust, and a stronger neighborhood. In honor of Earth Day, Soul Seeds helped restore an overgrown courtyard at a nursing and rehab center. In one day, volunteers cleared the space, transplanted a rose bush, and planted flowers, vegetables, and a tea garden. When we returned the next week, residents were glowing with pride, already caring for the garden as their own. At New Fountains Apartments in Fitchburg, Wisconsin, a youth group called the Justice League asked for help building a raised bed garden. Even in pouring rain, they built the frame, filled it with soil, and planted the garden, showing that community grows strongest when people serve together, rain or shine. Led by the Royal Falcon Foundation, powered by partners including the Bridge to Kindness, Summit Credit Union, and the Belleville Community Health Improvement Project, Soul Seeds is now being piloted in Wisconsin and Ohio as a model for broader community and credit union engagement. One day can launch it. 1 year can sustain it. One community at a time, Soul Seeds helps neighbors plant, manage, and harvest a better future. Join us and grow with us.
Welcome back. We're here with Steve Bezner, author of Your Jesus is Too American. And right before the break, we learned about his background, what led to his perspectives and his approach. Let's talk about a little bit about what's in that book. What's the core central message and some of the highlights or points or chapters in that book?
Yeah, thanks, Wade. I think that really the core message of the book is that culture tends to be the most influential defining factor in the life of the American church. And I argue that we should embrace what Jesus teaches in the New Testament as our primary definition. And in doing so, we will actually become way more effective as a church. So it's kind of this idea of acknowledging that, America has influence on all of us, but that the New Testament should have more sway. And so we really just kind of do a deep dive in what Jesus teaches on a number of different topics. So what does Jesus teach about, for instance, politics? What does Jesus teach about power? What does Jesus teach about racism? These kinds of things. And so we look at what the New Testament speaks on those things, and then we hold those up against the 21st century American culture. And then we sort of come to a moment of decision. Okay, how are we going to respond to that? And in the middle of all, or I'm sorry, not in the middle, but in the background, we use Jesus's teaching of the kingdom of God as sort of the mirror for everything. So Jesus comes and he teaches on earth as it is in heaven. The kingdom of God is at hand. And so we say, okay, well, Jesus wants us to experience this reality of the rule and reign of God here and now. What does that look like? And so it's sort of this recognition. We recognize Jesus as king, and then we begin to live into that kingship here and now. Not wait until we go to heaven, but to start to live it out here and now.
So as you're talking, I'm thinking about this in light of I just recently on the show, we're pre-recording, so by the time this show airs, it'll have been a little bit further back, but I just recently had Mark Galley on the show. He was the editor-in-chief of Scientific American, of Christianity Today, rather. Sorry. George Musser just talked to him. He was Scientific American. But anyway, Mark Galley was the editor-in-chief of Christianity Today, and he spent over 30 years there. And I was talking to him about how Christianity Today was a moving target. And over the course, because Christianity Today when he started, which may have been in, 1980 or 90, then changed in 2000, and 2000 is always a moving target. And he was explaining how in Christianity Today, they were actually moving away from fundamentalist evangelical thinking. They were progressive in that sense. And that's part of why the word today was in the title, because they didn't want to be the Christianity of yesterday. You know what I'm saying? Now, the reason I bring this up is, as you're talking, I'm thinking about Jesus, and I'm thinking about statements from him who's, that are like, you've heard it said in times of old, right? But I say to you, and he used the analogy of a new wine in old wineskins. So he was very progressive, he's moving things forward. But he was also in some ways not abandoning the past. He said, I've not come to destroy the law or the prophets, but to fulfill. So he was anchored in that while looking forward and to move things forward. If we fast forward now 2,000 years later, we have this nation of America. But as I look at the Bible and the Word of God being an eternal word that is always applicable, the question comes of throwing babies out with bathwaters. I don't know what your take is on any of this, and I'm just kind of reacting to what I'm hearing from you and imagining what the book is saying and how you're saying it.
Yeah, I think that what you're saying resonates, Wade, because we have to think about, where does the faith meet us now? I think that my book will be relevant in 100 years, but maybe not, because things are always shifting. But I think that the truth is that the church lives within a specific culture. And one of the things that I point out in the book is that the reason that the church grew rapidly in the first century is because it was so distinct from the culture at large. They cared about the poor, they cared about the elderly, they cared about the sick, they adopted and brought in children who had been abandoned and helped go against the plague of infanticide that was present in the first century in Rome. They had all these unique qualities. And so one of the things that I'm driving at in the book is this sense of to go back to your example, the Christianity Today, the way that things are relevant today may shift, the best way to express that. But I think that oftentimes the church has bought into the idea the way that we're relevant is, well, we have cooler music, we have fog machines, we have better coffee, we dress down now. And those are fine things, but that's not really, I think, the way that you cut through the fog of culture. Instead, the way that you cut through the fog is you live in a way that is distinct. And so you care about things that allow you to love people in the community in a way that is surprising. And so one of the things I talk about in the book is just, generosity and the fact that Jesus cared about the poor. And, it's not a comprehensive plan on how to handle the poor, but it is instead an argument that the church needs to be people who care about the poor, because we live in a day and an age where wealth is incredibly important, and often wealth is seen as something that means that you work hard, whereas if you're poor, you must not work hard. And I just talk about the fact that, if Jesus cared about the poor and the early church cared about the poor, we have to think about what that means for us. And it probably is different in different states and different cities and different communities, but I don't know that we get the pass to no longer care about those who are in financial need. So it's just sort of taking the sense to say, these are some timeless big issues that seem to have been a thorn in the side of the church and even our country. I don't know that we can fix them, but we do need to acknowledge them and see if we can gravitate towards the way that Jesus has addressed these, rather than what we think, politicians are really fired up about, or various ideologues that we might find online.
Awesome. So let's do a little thought experiment and take one tiny little micro bullet point
Okay.
and just explore it. And the bullet point that comes to mind is Jesus' statement, because you mentioned poor. The poor you always have with you. Now there's a theological, but it has to do with the anointing of his feet, and that but let's isolate that out, not to take it out of context or rip it out of context, but the statement, the poor are always with you, or you will always have the poor with you. In terms of social teachings, what does that mean in America today? There are different ways to interpret what he was getting at with that statement, and people can react differently to it and maybe behave differently based on their understanding of it. But if we're going to say, well, your Jesus is too American, well, let's try to apply his statement to the American situation without interpreting it as an American, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that whenever Jesus said that, he was letting us know it's probably impossible to solve the problem of poverty. I don't know that I could speak definitively about this, but I think no matter what nation we visited on the face of the globe, every country has those who are poor among them.
To solve poverty, to oversimplify, you would have to take away free will. And that isn't something God wants to do.
Right. And I think that, so in other words, if we went to a socialist country or a communist country or capitalistic, there's always going to be poor folks there. So I think that Jesus is acknowledging the fact that we can't solve poverty, but at the same time, he commended generosity on a number of places and spaces. Whenever John the Baptist was speaking about Jesus coming, he said early on, the one who has 2 cloaks should give one of those cloaks to the person who has none. And the person who is essentially assessing taxes should not overtax those who have them. I think it's no accident whenever Jesus runs into Zacchaeus, that Zacchaeus is convicted that he has been overtaxing his neighbors and says, anyone that I've defrauded, I'll return multiple fold over. So I think there's this sense in which part of Jesus's kingdom message was that we would be generous with the things we have, which is why I think that in the earliest expression of the church in the book of Acts in chapter 2, that we read that no one among them was in need, because those who had shared with those who did not. So I just think that all of that was sort of within the ethos of what it was that Jesus was trying to teach. So I don't think that he ever thought we're going to be able to eradicate poverty, but I also think that he would push back against someone who would say, well, people have to figure out on their own, or we don't help folks. I think that part of the mentality that Jesus gave us was that we would be people who would be willing to be inconvenienced by the needs of others, and we would look to see how it was that we could help them within our ability.
Thank you. Agree 100% with what you're saying. Another twist to this, I guess, now that I'm thinking about this, would be to weave in this idea: render under Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and under God the things that are God's. It's another statement of Jesus, because in America, we're a democracy. We're a nation that has been very innovative. Even our Constitution was an experiment. There's a great series out on Netflix right now. I think it's called The American Experience. It's about 5 episodes. It goes into the founding fathers, goes into how slavery was a core central question that almost stopped the United States from forming, because the states couldn't agree and they made compromises, which we look back at from the vantage point of today's moral superiority and judge them for making said compromises. But without said compromises, the United States wouldn't have been formed at all. And ultimately, in the crucible of war in 1863, those questions were then decided, and we became a nation that abolished slavery. But I'm off track here. But the point is, the American experiment, innovative people, problem solving, democracy. We want to solve things today through political action, and yet not all things can be solved by politics or policies. So render under Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God. How would Jesus address American society that views him in ways that are too American. What's your thought on that complex? And I don't have an opinion. I'm just thinking here. I'm just curious.
No, that's great. So, you know, the Christian position would be that the church is a community that testifies to the resurrection of Jesus. And we try to live in light of that power and in light of that reality, which would be that one day death will be conquered and that all things will be set right. So the idea in the book is that we live in the resurrection reality today. And that means then, you're right, Wade, there are so many things that cannot be solved by policy for a lot of reasons. Sometimes we can't, it's too complicated. We can't deal with every possible legal eventuality. We can't deal with all of the exceptions. There's too much bureaucracy, all of this.
The lawgiver gave 10 commandments, right? Moses gave 10 commandments. And how many books does it take just to contain the tax code today? Speaking of Zacchaeus and what he did or didn't do ethically or logically. Right?
Exactly. And so in that sense, we know that we can't write policy to get our ways out of this. But I do think the beautiful thing about the church is that the church can oftentimes just act. And so if we are testifying to the resurrection, that death is not the end, and that one day all things will be set right, whenever we see people in need, or whenever we see something that needs to be addressed in a community, we have the flexibility oftentimes to say, what does a resurrection reality look like for this particular community? What does it look like to help people who have special needs? What does it look like to help speak to racial discussions in our community? What does it look like to help those who are struggling with addiction? What does it look like to help people in poverty? And so we may partner with the government if it's convenient, but also we can oftentimes just say, we just want to find a way to do this that's more practical, more immediate, and does so in a way that points to this other way of being in the world.
So so those are the things that sort of interested me. What are some of the practical or specific examples that you address in your book? Are there some like very material specific points, certain cultural icons or ideas that you address in particular in your book?
Great question. I think that one of the things I really talk about is that so much of the struggle in our current culture is surrounded by an obsession with power. And that one of the best things that Christians and as a whole the church can do is to reevaluate its own relationship with power. And I would never be so naive as to say that we can't be people who have any sort of power, because we all, if we're parents, we have, some kind of power over our children or that sort of thing. But the idea is instead to have a healthy relationship with power and to not use it in an authoritative, destructive way, but instead to hold it in such a way that we can help bring about health, goodness, and flourishing in whatever realm we are. So if we're a business owner, to treat our employees in a particular way. If we find ourselves on the school board, to hold our that kind of power in a particular way. If we are someone who is in a position of authority within a church, to not use that in a controlling, manipulative way, but instead to use it in a way that helps people grow into the people that God wants them to be loving and kind, that sort of thing. So like that's just the first thing that comes to mind, is this sense that, the things that follow, money, politics, race, et cetera, a lot of that flows from a twisted picture of power. And so I kind of jump into that almost immediately. If I was going to give you a second one, the other one is loving our enemies. I think that that's, to me at least, the most challenging command that Jesus gives. And he gives a lot of challenging ones, but for me, that's the hardest one. But I also think that it is an embrace of relinquishing power, that I have to be the one to hand out vengeance. And those two things, I think, are things that whenever I speak about the book, whenever I speak about these things that have been important to me along the way, those two things really seem to get people thinking. How would I reevaluate my relationship with power? And what would it look like for me to love the people who I consider to be my enemies?
Wow, a lot of really, really deep questions and issues there. We could go in many different directions right now with some of the things you've raised. and I'll try to not go in any of them other than to just because I want to hear more from you versus being too directive here. But one of the things that that comes to mind is that in terms of Jesus, our Jesus being too American, I think now, okay, so the people to whom Jesus came in his day, their Jesus, the Jesus they were expecting, we might say he was too Maccabean, right? They were expecting a Jesus to come who would speak truth to power. Now, Jesus did speak truth to power. It's funny, he told Pilate, I am, I forget when it came up, the truth, and Pilate's response was, what is truth? Jesus actually did speak truth to power in a sense, but he was a disappointment to all those who thought he was going to do something about it, right? What he did about it was completely unexpected. He sacrificed himself. And the way that I think about this in terms of this power is Paul the apostle later talks about this issue of the husband being the head of the wife. And that his statement, yes, the husband is the head of the wife, sort of affirming that idea, is what some people have remembered. But he's actually completely flipping the script, because he says, yeah, the husband is, in a sense, the head of the wife, in the way that Jesus is the head of the church, in which he wasn't the head at all. He served it. He says, what was it that Jesus did? He served it. He came and he sacrificed. He became a sacrifice for us. He used his power to lay down his arms and become a sacrificial lamb.
Yeah.
Of course, one could say, well, he's supposed to return again in power and glory. But I guess, again, I'm just opening up a discussion. What's your reaction to all this? Again, in the context of America today and people that think too much in terms of power.
Yeah, I think it's a really driving question right now. And I think that's why the questions of power and enemy love are so related. So I was in Houston for many, many years. And I did not know this until I moved to Houston, that Houston is, if not one of the most ethnically diverse cities in the nation.
Interesting.
Yeah. In 2013,
I didn't know that either.
Yeah, in 2013, Houston surpassed New York City for that designation. And I think since then it's kind of gone back and forth. But what was fascinating to me was to discover how large of a Muslim population there was in Houston. And to also recognize that so many people in my congregation had been thinking of people who were Muslim as enemies since 9/11. And so as I was doing a deep dive on this topic, I think one of the questions that came up was, well, if we see the people in our neighborhood who are Muslim as our enemies, and Jesus commands us to love our enemies, what does that look like? And so we began a conversation that would be too long to really jump into on this particular podcast, but it culminated with the leadership from the mosque eating with the leadership of our church in homes. It culminated with about 30 people from the local mosque attending our Easter services and us hosting a brunch for them afterwards and answering all of their questions. I loved it because their first question after attending an Easter service was, where was the rabbit? We never saw the rabbit. I think that was great. They asked honest theological questions about Jesus and the cross. And whenever our city, Houston, was hit by Hurricane Harvey in 2017, our church was flooded. And we had a lot of local churches that showed up to help us clean everything out and reset. But we also had one mosque that showed up to help us. And they had sensed love from us, and they wanted to reciprocate that. And it really helped me rewire my own brain on the fact that I'm not naive. I know that people have different perspectives, worldviews, goals. Completely believe that. At the same time, I think that the only way that we're going to be able to live together is if we find ways to love one another and to express that, because that's how bridges are built in the first place.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So let's go to another quick commercial break. When we come back, I'm going to ask the question, where are you growing next? Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back to wrap up the conversation with Steve Bezner here on Created in the Image of God.
In a world where religions often talk past each other, what if we just sat down and listened? Facets of One is a simple devotional, bringing together scripture from the world's faiths, centered on one truth. God is one. From the Bible to the Quran, from Krishna to Christ, each voice speaks in turn, without argument, without division. You don't have to agree on everything. Just be willing to pray, to listen, and to come together. If you're longing for something deeper than noise and division, this is a different kind of conversation. Facets of One. Many voices, one God. Will you start a circle?
Welcome back. We're wrapping up the show today with Steve Bezner, and we have a big question for him that remains. Where are you growing next? In the wake of the book, in the wake of the experiences, the interfaith, the racial discussions, reviewing American culture and looking at it through the lens of the Word of God and what would Jesus do? What's next on the horizon for you?
Yeah, thank you. Great question, Wade. So I'm currently working at a seminary, and I'm trying to train other pastors or future pastors rather, to think in terms of kingdom as they find themselves leading a community or a congregation. But the place where personally I'm probably growing the most is in thinking about how to navigate the social fabric of the United States that to me feels like it's being ripped apart. And so the place where I'm really growing is thinking about how to become a force for peacemaking, bridge building, and healing between these various groups, and to see if we can find common ground to come back together instead of going further and further apart. I'm not a sociologist, I'm not an expert, but it seems to me that in my lifetime, this is the most divided the country has been. And if we don't find some ways to bring about some healing, then we may cross a point of no return where the country may not literally fracture, but it may essentially and practically fracture. And I would really like to see us find ways to navigate that. And so I think that the church has been weaponized in a lot of ways in the past. And so I'm looking for ways to think about how can we stop being a weapon and how can we instead start being a balm of healing. And so those are things that I'm really growing in and experimenting with and looking to bring to the table.
Well, and that's exactly up the alley of this show. This show exists for similar reasons and purposes. And what I try to do is bring people from a huge diversity of perspectives and allow them to explain why. I was actually in the Soviet Union at the collapse of the Soviet Union, literally coming in from Finland to Leningrad as tanks were coming from Moscow at the point in time when Gorbachev had been abducted and Yeltsin was coming to power. There was a coup, and those tanks stopped 50 miles outside of Leningrad, now back to St. Petersburg. And they laid down their arms and said, we're not Stalin. We're not going to open up fire on our own people. I didn't know how bad it was as I was coming in. It's a long story why I was there and whatnot. But then I was in Leningrad at Radio TV Leningrad, where we were working on bringing in programming from the West. Particularly, we wanted to get religious programming in, and we'd done work in Poland, Czechoslovakia, with the denomination that I was in, and I was pastoring a church in Estonia, among other things. Well, actually, I think that came later. Sorry, I was not yet doing that. But anyway, these young Western-oriented people, guys, were saying, in this time of crisis, these satellite nations will return to Mother Russia. I was looking like, are you kidding me? They will not return to Mother Russia. Then their hatred is so deep. And I was thinking, why could they not see that? They had enough exposure to the West to know this. How could they be blind to this? And I realized everybody thinks they're right. No matter what, no matter where you grew up, no matter how you grew up, you think you're right. You believe what you do because you think it's the right thing. You think it's a good thing.
Mm.
And so the ideological divide in America, it consists of people on both sides who think they're right, think they're doing the right thing, think they're doing it for the right reasons, and they actually have good intentions in their heart.
Agreed. And I think that healing comes from a point of humility to say, what if I'm wrong about something?
Right.
And just opening the door to curiosity begins a space where bridges can be built. And so maybe the area where I'm growing is that I'm looking for people who are willing to be humble and curious, because I think it's humble and curious people who can help make a difference in the long run.
Well, this gets back to one of the core messages of the book of Matthew, Matthew 7, verse 1, judge not lest ye be judged. Whatever standard of judgment you set up is how God is going to judge you. So these two sides that are accusing each other of destroying democracy, we all know that when you point a finger, three are pointing back at you. And if the people on both sides can't see what they're doing in blaming and shaming the other side, rather than working together, then guess what? You're both destroying democracy because you're destroying the possibility of civil dialogue.
Yeah, absolutely. Now you nailed it there. That's exactly right, Wade.
Well, thank you so much for the conversation today. We're kind of out of time, but we got a minute or two. We'll be airing the sneak peek. Want everyone to stay tuned for that to see what's coming up next week. But what are your final words and thoughts to leave with the audience today?
Yeah, thank you, Wade. I would say for those who are listening that are Christian, I would say to embrace the radical nature of Jesus's grace, love, and mercy, and to lean in. Don't believe the lie that it's weak and that it can't make a difference, but actually it's what the world needs more than anything right now. For those of you who aren't Christians, completely understand. I would say, if anything, consider that Jesus is at least revolutionary and controversial in a good way enough for you to investigate and put into practice what you think is possible for you.
And if he has been presented to you as an American, he wasn't.
Yeah, great add-on. Yeah.
Well, Steve, thank you so much for being here today. I hope for the audience, they'll check out your book. They can find it on Amazon. Is there a stevebezner.com?
There is. Yeah.
So check out Steve and his work. Obviously, there's a lot more right there under the surface. You put a lot of thought and depth into this, to these views and this analysis, and we wish you all the best as you move forward. Stay tuned for the sneak peek, and we'll see you all next week.
Next week on Created in the Image of God. Sunday, August 23rd at 7 a.m. U.S. Central Time. Host Wade Franson interviews Sarah E. Fraser, author, Bible teacher, and speaker. She reflects on trusting God's goodness when life doesn't unfold the way we expected. From fear and uncertainty to finding hope, peace, and rest in the middle of life's unexpected turns. And then on Tuesday, August 25th at 8 p.m. Central Time, host Wade Franson interviews Paul Dafford-Jones, theologian, professor, and author. He explores the theology of patience and why waiting can become one of the deepest expressions of Christian faith, from Christology and public theology to discovering the wisdom, freedom, and hope found in patient faith. Join us live this week, Tuesday and Sunday, Created in the Image of God.